The year was 1509, and across Europe, kings and queens lived lives of unimaginable luxury and privilege. Golden chalices, silk tapestries, and servants attending to their every whim painted a picture of royal romance that fairy tales are made of. But behind the gilded doors of one particular palace, something far more sinister was unfolding. Something so twisted and horrifying that it would make your skin crawl and your stomach turn. Henry VIII of England wasn't just collecting wives like playing cards. He was orchestrating a bedroom nightmare so depraved, so psychologically torturous, that it turned marriage into a death sentence and intimacy into evidence for the executioner's block. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about royal life and expose the brutal reality of what it meant to share a bed with one of history's most monstrous tyrants. These weren't just unusual customs or quirky royal traditions. These were systematic methods of control, humiliation, and terror that transformed the most private human experiences into public spectacles of shame. The bedroom rules Henry imposed on his wives were so cruel, so invasive, and so utterly dehumanizing that they would be considered torture by any modern standard. Today, we're peeling back the velvet curtains and exposing 7 horrifying bedroom rules that Henry VIII used to terrorize his wives. Rules so disturbing that they've been sanitized from history books, hidden behind euphemisms, and kept secret from public knowledge for centuries. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why being married to Henry wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a descent into hell itself. The first rule we need to examine is perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all. Every wedding night in Henry's court wasn't a private celebration of love between two people. It was a judicial proceeding where failure to provide evidence could literally cost a queen her life. The wedding night tribunal was Henry's first and most invasive bedroom rule. Imagine walking down the aisle knowing that your most intimate moment as a newlywed would be scrutinized, documented, and judged by an entire court of officials. This wasn't romance. This was a medieval forensic investigation disguised as a honeymoon. The moment Henry's bedroom door closed on his wedding night, the clock started ticking on a terrifying countdown. Royal physicians, court officials, and trusted servants positioned themselves strategically throughout the palace, ready to collect evidence that would prove the marriage had been properly consummated. The sheets weren't just bedding. They were potential crime scene evidence that would be examined with the intensity of a murder investigation. But the horror didn't stop at sheet inspection. Queens were subjected to physical examinations the morning after their wedding night that would traumatize modern couples beyond belief. Royal doctors would inspect the bride's body for signs of consummation, document their findings in official court records, and present their conclusions to Henry's advisors. Privacy didn't exist. Dignity was irrelevant. The Queen's body became state property the moment she said her wedding vows. The psychological torture of knowing that servants were listening outside the door, timing the encounter, and preparing to judge your performance created an atmosphere of terror that poisoned what should have been the most intimate moment of a woman's life. Queens reported lying awake in dread for weeks before their wedding, knowing that their survival might depend on producing enough physical evidence to satisfy Henry's paranoid demands. Catherine of Aragon lived this nightmare firsthand. Historical accounts describe her wedding night as less of a romantic encounter and more like a medical procedure with an audience. The young Spanish princess, barely 16 years old, found herself subjected to examinations that modern medical ethics would consider assault. Court records document how she was inspected, questioned, and ultimately declared suitable for royal marriage based on physical evidence that had nothing to do with love or compatibility. But even passing this initial test was no guarantee of safety. The wedding night tribunal was just the beginning of a lifetime of surveillance and suspicion that would follow every one of Henry's wives to their graves or divorce proceedings. The second bedroom rule that Henry imposed reveals the depths of his narcissistic control over his wives. No matter how sick, diseased, or repulsive he became, royal wives were forbidden from ever refusing his advances. This rule wasn't just about marital obligations, it was about absolute submission to a king whose body was literally rotting while he still lived. The absolute submission rule meant that queens had no autonomy over their own bodies. When Henry summoned a wife to his chambers, she was required to obey immediately, regardless of her health, emotional state, or the absolutely horrifying condition of the king himself. Refusal wasn't just disrespectful, it was considered treason punishable by death. As Henry aged and his body deteriorated into a medical nightmare, this rule became increasingly cruel. By his later marriages, the king suffered from massive obesity, festering leg ulcers that never healed, and infections that made his flesh literally rot off his bones. The smell of decay followed him everywhere, and his bedroom reeked of death and disease. Yet his wives were still expected to share his bed and pretend they found him desirable. Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, endured perhaps the worst of this torture. Historical accounts describe her holding perfumed cloths over her nose during intimate encounters because the stench of Henry's decomposing body was so overwhelming it made her physically sick. She had to breathe through fabric just to avoid vomiting, while her husband, who weighed over 400 pounds and whose leg wounds oozed pus constantly, demanded her affection and submission. The psychological impact of this rule cannot be overstated. Queens lived in constant fear that showing any hesitation or reluctance would be reported as evidence of disloyalty. Henry had spies monitoring his wives' reactions to his summons. If a queen took too long to respond, appeared anything less than enthusiastic, or showed signs of physical revulsion, it was documented as potential evidence of betrayal. Modern psychologists would immediately recognize this as systematic sexual coercion and domestic abuse on an institutional level. Henry had weaponized intimacy, turning what should have been private moments between husband and wife into opportunities for surveillance and control. His wives weren't partners in marriage. They were prisoners whose bodies belonged to the state and whose survival depended on their ability to perform enthusiasm for encounters that must have felt like torture. The third bedroom rule reveals how Henry twisted his own sexual failures into evidence against his wives. Rather than admit that his diseased, obese body might not be capable of normal, intimate relations, he created a system where his wives would be blamed for his physical shortcomings. The performance evaluation rule turned every intimate encounter into a test where the queen's life depended on her husband's sexual satisfaction. If Henry couldn't perform, if conception didn't occur, or if he simply lost interest in his wife, the blame was automatically shifted to the woman. She would be accused of witchcraft, of casting spells to interfere with the royal manhood, or of using supernatural means to prevent pregnancy. This twisted logic created an impossible situation for Henry's wives. They were responsible for outcomes completely beyond their control, while being married to a man whose body was failing in every possible way. Medical experts believe Henry suffered from severe erectile dysfunction due to his massive weight gain, infected wounds, and possible diabetes. But admitting the king had performance issues was considered treason, so his wives became scapegoats for his body's natural response to being a walking medical disaster. The psychological cruelty of this system was staggering. Queens knew that their husband's inability to function sexually could somehow become their fault, and potentially their death sentence. They lived with the constant anxiety that factors completely beyond their control would be used as evidence of their guilt in imaginary crimes. Anne of Cleves experienced this nightmare when Henry claimed he couldn't consummate their marriage because she was so physically repulsive that she had cursed his royal abilities. The annulment proceedings became a public humiliation, where Anne's appearance and supposed supernatural influence on the king's body were debated by court officials. Her survival depended on accepting blame for Henry's failures, while maintaining her dignity in the face of utterly degrading accusations. Royal physicians were required to examine both the king and queen after intimate encounters, creating what amounted to sexual performance reviews that could determine life or death. These weren't private medical consultations. They were official evaluations where doctors documented every detail of the royal couple's intimate life for potential use in future legal proceedings. The horror of knowing that your most private moments were being graded like a school examination, with your life hanging in the balance based on factors you couldn't control, created a level of psychological torture that modern minds can barely comprehend. Henry had turned his bedroom into a courtroom, where his wives were always on trial for crimes that existed only in his paranoid imagination. The fourth bedroom rule Henry enforced stripped away any illusion of privacy that his wives might have clung to during their most vulnerable moments. What happened behind the royal bedroom doors wasn't private at all. It was performance art, with a deadly audience that documented every sound, every movement, and every whispered word for potential use as evidence in future treason trials. The surveillance state rule transformed Henry's bedroom into something resembling a modern interrogation facility rather than a place of marital intimacy. Guards were positioned directly outside the royal chambers during every encounter, not to protect the king and queen, but to gather intelligence that could later be weaponized against the woman sharing his bed. These weren't casual observers or distant sentries. Henry handpicked trusted spies whose sole responsibility was to monitor bedroom activities with the precision of court stenographers. They documented the duration of intimate encounters, noted unusual sounds or conversations, and reported any behavior that might be construed as suspicious or treasonous. The psychological impact of knowing you were being watched during your most private moments created a level of anxiety that bordered on torture. Queens had to perform intimacy while knowing that their every reaction was being evaluated by hidden observers who might twist their responses into evidence of guilt. A moment of hesitation could be interpreted as reluctance. A sign of pleasure could be viewed as evidence of sexual experience with other men. There was no safe reaction, no correct response that would guarantee survival. But the surveillance went beyond simple listening posts. Henry had peepholes installed in his bedroom walls, allowing trusted courtiers to literally watch his intimate encounters with his wives. These weren't temporary modifications made in moments of paranoia. They were permanent architectural features designed into the royal chambers, revealing the systematic nature of Henry's voyeuristic control over his marriages. Court physicians waited outside the bedroom door during intimate moments, ready to examine both the king and queen immediately after each encounter. The bedroom became less of a private sanctuary and more like a medical facility where the most personal aspects of marriage were treated as clinical procedures requiring professional documentation and analysis. The servants who cleaned the royal chambers were interrogated regularly about what they had seen, heard, or suspected. Bed linens were examined like crime scene evidence. Personal items were scrutinized for signs of suspicious activity. Even the Queen's facial expressions and body language the morning after intimate encounters were documented and analysed for potential signs of disloyalty or deception. This created an environment where queens could never truly relax or let their guard down. Every intimate moment carried the weight of potential death sentences. Every private conversation could be twisted into evidence of treason. The bedroom that should have been their refuge became the most dangerous place in the entire palace. Anne Boleyn lived this nightmare more intensely than perhaps any of Henry's other wives. Historical records show that her bedroom activities were monitored so closely that court officials could provide detailed testimony about her private conversations with the king. Words spoken in what she believed were moments of intimacy were later presented as evidence of her alleged plotting against the crown during her trial. The fifth bedroom rule reveals perhaps the most dehumanizing aspect of Henry's marital system. His wives weren't valued as individuals, companions, or even as human beings worthy of basic respect. They were viewed exclusively as breeding stock, whose only purpose was to produce male heirs, and their worth was measured entirely by their reproductive success or failure. The breeding machine rule reduced queens to their biological functions in the most brutal way imaginable. Every aspect of their intimate lives was controlled, monitored, and manipulated to maximize the chances of pregnancy, with no regard for their physical health, emotional well-being, or personal autonomy. Royal physicians tracked each queen's menstrual cycles with obsessive precision, using medieval medical knowledge that was often completely wrong and sometimes dangerous. They examined urine samples, monitored eating habits, and even analyzed dreams for signs of pregnancy. When conception didn't occur quickly enough, increasingly invasive medical procedures were performed on the Queen's body without her consent or understanding. The pressure to conceive wasn't just professional obligation, it was literally a matter of life and death. Queens who failed to produce male heirs faced accusations of deliberately preventing pregnancy through witchcraft or supernatural interference. The inability to conceive became evidence of treason, turning a woman's natural reproductive cycle into potential grounds for execution. Henry's wives were subjected to fertility treatments that modern medicine would recognize as torture. They were force-fed herbs and potions that were often poisonous, subjected to bloodletting procedures that weakened their bodies, and required to follow bizarre rituals designed to increase conception chances. Their diets were completely controlled based on medieval theories about fertility, with no consideration for their nutritional needs or personal preferences. Catherine of Aragon endured perhaps the worst of this reproductive torture. After multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, she was subjected to increasingly desperate medical interventions. Court physicians examined her body regularly, prescribed treatments that often made her violently ill, and ultimately blamed her for Henry's growing obsession with finding a wife who could produce surviving male children. The psychological cruelty of being valued only for reproductive capacity created lasting trauma that affected every aspect of these women's lives. They lived with the constant knowledge that their worth as human beings was tied entirely to biological functions beyond their complete control. A failed pregnancy wasn't just personal loss. It was evidence of inadequacy that could justify their replacement, exile, or execution. But even more horrifying was the realization that success in producing children offered no guarantee of safety. Anne Boleyn gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. Yet her failure to produce male heirs was used as evidence of her supposed inability to fulfill her royal duties, contributing to the fabricated charges that led to her beheading. The sixth bedroom rule demonstrates how Henry used intimate relationships as weapons of psychological warfare against his own wives. Once a queen began to lose his favor, the very bed they shared became a trap where every word, gesture, and reaction could be twisted into evidence for treason trials that were often predetermined. The entrapment rule turned intimate encounters into interrogation sessions, where Henry would test his wife's loyalty through increasingly bizarre and humiliating demands. If queens complied with his requests, their compliance was viewed as evidence of manipulation or witchcraft. If they resisted, their reluctance became proof of betrayal or disloyalty. This created an impossible psychological maze where there were no correct responses, only different paths to the same deadly conclusion. Henry would continue summoning wives to his chamber even after he had already decided to have them executed, using their private moments together to gather additional evidence for charges that were often completely fabricated. Catherine Howard experienced this particular horror in her final months as queen. While secret investigations into her past relationships were already underway, Henry continued to demand her presence in his bedroom, testing her reactions and recording her responses for later use in her trial. She was forced to maintain the pretense of marital affection with a man who was actively planning her murder. The conversations that took place during these intimate encounters were documented by spies and later presented as evidence in treason proceedings. Pillow talk became potential death sentences. Private confessions of fear, uncertainty, or even expressions of love were twisted into admissions of guilt for crimes that existed only in Henry's paranoid imagination. Modern experts in domestic abuse would immediately recognize this pattern of behavior. Henry was using intimacy as a form of psychological torture, creating an environment where his wives never felt safe and turning their most vulnerable moments into opportunities for gathering evidence to use against them later. The cruel genius of this system was that it made resistance impossible. Queens couldn't refuse Henry's summons without providing evidence of disloyalty. They couldn't comply enthusiastically without risking accusations of manipulation. They couldn't express fear without confirming suspicions of guilt. Every possible response became another piece of evidence in the case Henry was building against them. This psychological torture often lasted for months before the final accusations were made public. Wives lived with the growing awareness that something was wrong, that their husband's behavior toward them was changing, but they had no way to protect themselves or escape the trap that was slowly closing around them. The bedroom became a place of dread where they awaited whatever twisted test Henry would devise next. The seventh and perhaps most physically revolting bedroom rule forced Henry's wives to endure intimate contact with a body that had become so diseased and grotesque that sharing his bed required genuine heroism just to avoid showing visible revulsion. By his later years, Henry's physical condition had deteriorated to such an extent that intimacy with him was like being forced to embrace a living corpse. The disease tolerance rule required queens to maintain the fiction that they found their increasingly repulsive husband attractive and desirable, even as his body literally rotted around them. Henry's massive obesity, infected wounds, and various medical conditions had transformed him into something that barely resembled a human being. Yet his wives were expected to share his bed with enthusiasm and grace. By the time of his marriage to Catherine Parr, Henry weighed over 400 pounds and required mechanical assistance just to move his enormous bulk. His leg ulcers had become so severe that chunks of necrotic flesh would fall from his body and contaminate whatever he touched. The smell of infection and decay permeated his clothing, his bedding, and the very air around him. Yet Catherine Parr was still required to share this nightmare of a bed and pretend she was honoured by her husband's attention. Historical accounts describe how she would prepare for intimate encounters by breathing through perfumed cloths, desperately trying to mask the overwhelming stench of Henry's decomposing flesh. The psychological strength required to endure this horror while maintaining the appearance of wifely devotion speaks to the incredible courage of these women. The infected wounds on Henry's body would often burst open during physical exertion, covering anyone near him with pus and rotting tissue. Queens had to endure being splattered with their husband's bodily fluids while continuing to perform the role of loving wife. The bedsheets required special handling and cleaning procedures just to remove the stains and odours left behind by Henry's diseased body. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from severe diabetes, multiple infections, and possibly gangrene in his final years. His body was literally dying while he was still alive, yet he continued to demand intimate relations from wives who must have required tremendous willpower just to remain in the same room with him. The physical revulsion these women must have felt was compounded by the knowledge that showing any sign of disgust could be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty or lack of proper wifely devotion. They had to train themselves to suppress their natural human reactions to Henry's grotesque physical condition, while maintaining the pretense that they were grateful for his attention. The psychological trauma of maintaining this charade went far beyond physical revulsion. These women had to convince themselves that their survival depended on their ability to perform desire for a man whose body had become a monument to decay and disease. They developed coping mechanisms that modern therapists would recognize as dissociative responses to extreme trauma, mentally separating themselves from their physical experiences, just to endure what Henry demanded of them. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Henry's bedroom tyranny was how he weaponized gossip and rumor to destroy his wives, even when they had committed no actual crimes. The mere suggestion of impropriety became as deadly as concrete evidence, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where whispered conversations could cost a woman her head. The gossip execution rule transformed Henry's court into a surveillance state where servants, courtiers, and even fellow nobles became unwilling participants in a system of mutual destruction. Every casual comment about a queen's appearance, behavior, or mood could be twisted into evidence of sexual misconduct or treasonous plotting. The case of Anne Boleyn demonstrates the horrifying efficiency of this system. Her entire downfall was constructed from court gossip, forced confessions, and testimonies extracted under torture. Musicians who had performed at court gatherings were subjected to brutal interrogations until they confessed to imaginary sexual encounters with the Queen. Her own brother was executed based on accusations of incest that modern historians universally recognize as completely fabricated. Henry had created a network of informants whose primary responsibility was collecting and reporting bedroom-related rumors. Ladies-in-waiting were required to spy on their mistresses, documenting private conversations and reporting any behavior that could be construed as suspicious. Servants who cleaned the royal chambers were regularly interrogated about what they had observed, with their testimonies becoming official court records that could later be used in treason trials. The psychological impact of living under such intense surveillance created a paranoid atmosphere where queens could never trust anyone completely. They knew that their closest companions might be reporting their every word to Henry's spies. Private moments of vulnerability, expressions of fear or uncertainty, even innocent conversations about court life could be reinterpreted as evidence of guilt in crimes they had never committed. Catherine Howard's destruction followed this same pattern of manufactured evidence built from gossip and rumor. Her past relationships, which had occurred before her marriage to Henry and were completely legal at the time, were transformed into evidence of adultery and treason. Former lovers were tortured into providing testimony that condemned her, their forced confessions becoming the foundation for charges that would ultimately cost her her life. The terror of knowing that even innocent interactions could be twisted into evidence of betrayal created a level of psychological stress that modern minds can barely comprehend. Queens learned to guard their expressions, monitor their reactions, and carefully consider every word they spoke, knowing that any moment of unguarded behavior could provide ammunition for their enemies. Henry's bedroom had become the epicenter of a surveillance network that extended throughout his entire court. Conversations that took place in the supposed privacy of the royal chambers were recorded, analyzed, and stored for potential future use. The most intimate confessions between husband and wife became weapons that could be deployed against the woman whenever Henry decided her usefulness had expired. This system of manufactured evidence was so effective that it required no actual crimes to justify executions. The mere accumulation of gossip, rumor, and forced testimony was sufficient to condemn any woman who had lost Henry's favor. Truth became irrelevant when the machinery of accusation could create whatever evidence the king required to dispose of inconvenient wives. The final bedroom rule reveals the ultimate horror of Henry's marital system, the complete erasure of human dignity in service of royal paranoia. By his later years, Henry had transformed marriage itself into a form of legalized torture where women's bodies, minds, and souls became property of the state to be used and discarded at will. The dehumanization rule reduced Henry's wives to objects whose only value lay in their ability to serve the king's political and personal needs. They weren't partners, companions, or even human beings deserving of basic respect. They were tools to be used until they broke, then replaced with newer models who might prove more durable or useful. This systematic dehumanization began the moment a woman caught Henry's attention as a potential wife. She would be investigated, evaluated, and assessed like livestock being considered for purchase. Her family background, reproductive history, and physical attributes would be documented and analyzed by court officials who treated her as a commodity rather than a person. Once married, queens discovered that their previous identities had been completely erased. They existed solely as extensions of Henry's will, with no autonomy over their bodies, their time, or their relationships. Every aspect of their lives was controlled, monitored, and manipulated to serve the king's increasingly paranoid and violent impulses. The psychological destruction that resulted from this treatment was systematic and thorough. Women who had entered marriage with hopes of love, partnership, and mutual respect found themselves trapped in a nightmare where their humanity was slowly stripped away through daily humiliations and constant surveillance. They learned to suppress their natural emotional responses, to perform artificial enthusiasm for encounters that traumatized them, and to maintain facades of happiness while living in constant fear. Henry's court records reveal the casual brutality with which his wives were discussed by officials who had stopped thinking of them as human beings. They were referred to in terms typically reserved for animals or objects, evaluated based on their usefulness to the crown, rather than their worth as individuals. When they failed to meet expectations or simply outlived their utility, they were disposed of with the same emotional detachment one might show when discarding a broken tool. The women who survived this system, like Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, did so only by completely surrendering their sense of self and accepting their status as property rather than people. They learned to navigate Henry's volatile moods by becoming whatever he needed them to be at any given moment, sacrificing their authentic selves for the slim hope of survival. Modern experts in psychological trauma would recognize the symptoms these women displayed as classic indicators of systematic abuse and dehumanization. They developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to endure experiences that should have been unbearable, often by mentally disconnecting from their physical experiences and emotional responses. The most tragic aspect of this dehumanization was how completely it succeeded in erasing these women's individual stories. History remembers them primarily as Henry's wives, rather than as people with their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Their suffering has been romanticized, sanitized, and reduced to footnotes in the story of a king whose bedroom rules created a hell on earth for anyone unfortunate enough to share his bed. These 7 horrifying bedroom rules reveal the true nature of power in Henry's court, where absolute authority corrupted absolutely and turned the most intimate human relationships into weapons of control and destruction. The women who endured this system displayed courage that modern society can barely comprehend, surviving in conditions that would break most people while maintaining their dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that behind the glamour and pageantry of royal life lay a darkness so profound that it challenges our understanding of human cruelty. Henry's bedroom wasn't a place of love or intimacy. It was a chamber of horrors where women's lives were destroyed in service of one man's insatiable hunger for power and control. The legacy of these horrifying rules extends far beyond Henry's reign, revealing how easily civilized society can descend into barbarism when unchecked power meets paranoid cruelty. These weren't the actions of a madman acting alone, but the systematic implementation of policies that an entire court system supported and enforced, proving that evil on this scale requires the complicity of many supposedly civilized people. Civilized people. The psychological devastation these bedroom rules inflicted extended far beyond the immediate victims. Court servants who witnessed these horrors carried trauma that manifested in documented cases of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Chambermaids reported nightmares about the sounds they heard emanating from the royal quarters. Guards stationed outside Henry's bedroom developed nervous conditions from the psychological pressure of their surveillance duties. But perhaps most disturbing was how this system of bedroom tyranny infected the entire social structure of Tudor England. Noble families began implementing similar surveillance and control mechanisms in their own marriages, viewing Henry's methods as the pinnacle of proper marital governance. The king's bedroom rules became a template for domestic oppression that spread throughout the aristocracy like a plague of cruelty. Young women of noble birth grew up knowing that marriage meant the complete surrender of bodily autonomy and privacy. They were trained from childhood to suppress natural reactions of revulsion or fear, to perform enthusiasm on command, and to accept that their most intimate moments would be subject to inspection and judgment. This systematic preparation for marital abuse created generations of women who entered marriage already psychologically conditioned for victimization. The medical establishment of Henry's time became complicit in this systematic abuse by developing increasingly invasive procedures designed to monitor and control women's reproductive functions. Royal physicians pioneered examination techniques that were essentially medical torture, justified by the supposed necessity of ensuring royal fertility. These same methods were then applied to noble wives throughout England, creating a medical culture that viewed women's bodies as state resources rather than human beings deserving of care and respect. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed Henry's court described an atmosphere so oppressive and fearful that even visiting dignitaries felt uncomfortable. The Spanish ambassador wrote detailed accounts of the terror that permeated the royal household, noting how servants moved through the palace in constant fear and how even the most innocent conversations were conducted in whispers. The bedroom rules Henry enforced had created a culture of surveillance and suspicion that poisoned every relationship within his court. The international implications of Henry's bedroom tyranny extended far beyond England's borders. European courts began questioning whether marriages to English royalty were worth the risk, given Henry's established pattern of destroying his wives. This diplomatic isolation forced England into increasingly desperate alliances, as potential marriage partners for Henry's children were discouraged by the horrific fate that seemed to await anyone who shared a Tudor bed. The children who grew up in this atmosphere of bedroom surveillance and marital terror developed their own psychological scars that would influence their future reigns. Edward VI, Henry's long-awaited male heir, displayed signs of severe anxiety around intimate relationships that historians believe stemmed from childhood exposure to his father's treatment of stepmothers. Mary Tudor's violent persecution of Protestants may have been influenced by witnessing her mother, Catherine of Aragon's suffering under Henry's bedroom rules. Elizabeth I's famous decision to remain unmarried likely reflected a deep understanding of the horrors that marriage could bring to women in positions of power. The financial cost of maintaining Henry's bedroom surveillance system was staggering. Court records reveal enormous expenditures on spy networks, medical examinations, and the constant replacement of contaminated bedding and furnishings. The king's paranoid need to document and monitor every aspect of his wives' intimate lives required a bureaucracy of surveillance that diverted resources from more productive uses. England's treasury was drained not just by Henry's wars and palace construction, but by the elaborate machinery of marital oppression he constructed around his personal relationships. The religious implications of Henry's bedroom rules created theological crises that reverberated throughout the English church. Priests and religious advisors struggled to reconcile Christian teachings about marriage and human dignity with the systematic abuse they witnessed in the royal household. Some clergy attempted to counsel moderation and compassion, only to find themselves accused of interfering with royal prerogatives. Others became complicit in the abuse by providing religious justification for Henry's increasingly extreme demands on his wives. The legal precedents established by Henry's bedroom rules influenced English law for centuries after his death. The principle that a husband had absolute rights over his wife's body, regardless of her consent or physical condition, became embedded in legal doctrine that would not be fully overturned until the modern era. The idea that intimate relationships could be subject to state surveillance and regulation created legal frameworks that enabled domestic abuse throughout English society. Women throughout Tudor England lived with the knowledge that Henry's treatment of his queens established the acceptable limits of marital cruelty. If the king could subject his wives to such horrors with the full support of church and state, what hope did common women have for protection from abusive husbands? The psychological impact of this realization created a culture of female submission and terror that extended far beyond the palace walls. These 7 horrifying bedroom rules exposed the monstrous reality behind the Tudor crown, where marriage became murder and intimacy transformed into evidence for the executioner's axe. Henry VIII didn't just destroy 6 wives, He created a systematic torture chamber disguised as royal romance that poisoned English society for generations. The next time someone tells you fairy tales about royal love, remember the screams echoing through those palace walls and the women who died for refusing to pretend their nightmare was a dream.